There's a strange feeling you get when you watch Bleach in 2026 and suddenly realize this story was never really trying to be a traditional shonen in the first place. And somehow, a huge portion of what makes modern shonen so compelling today was born from this exact series. A lot of people now see Jujutsu Kaisen, Demon Slayer, or even Black Clover as the new face of dark shonen. But if you really look closely at how those stories are structured, it becomes almost impossible not to notice the DNA of Bleach all over them. And I'm not even talking about surface-level inspiration. Kubo genuinely changed the way authors approached atmosphere in battle manga. Geiji Akutami has never really hidden that influence either. His love for Bleach can be felt in almost every major arc of Jujutsu Kaisen. The curses resemble hollows not just visually, but conceptually too. And domain expansions honestly feel like an evolution of Bankai, especially when you remember Tosen's Bankai, where the space itself became a psychological trap. And that still genuinely blows my mind. Because even now, a lot of people still discuss Bleach mostly through the lens of ratings or sales numbers, when Kubo's real legacy exists somewhere completely different. He taught an entire generation of mangaka how to make style part of the storytelling itself. Not decoration, not background flavor, an actual narrative language. You only need to look at the way Kubo introduces characters. Even silence feels dramatic in his work. A white background, a stare, a few words, and suddenly the character already feels legendary. A lot of modern authors try to recreate that effect, but the difference is that with Kubo, it never worked because of posing alone. It worked because of this feeling of inner confidence. Bleach is a story where external style is constantly tied to the internal emotional state of the characters. That's exactly why the clothing in this manga feels so alive. Kubo basically turned fashion into a character writing tool, and there's another huge difference between this series and a lot of shonen from its era. Ichigo is an incredibly grounded protagonist. He doesn't have some massive dream of becoming king, Hokage, or the chosen savior of the world. He never even asked for all this power, and honestly, that's what makes him feel so human. You especially feel it after the Aizen arc. After defeating someone who was practically godlike, Ichigo doesn't become a legend. He doesn't go searching for some new grand purpose. He goes home and tries to live like a normal person again. For a shonen protagonist, that's honestly pretty unusual. But that's also why Ichigo feels closer to reality than a lot of iconic protagonists do. Another thing that always stood out to me is how Kubo portrays Ichigo as someone emotionally and intellectually calm. He studies, he has hobbies, he has an everyday life. At his core, he's just a regular guy. And that makes the antagonists in Bleach even more interesting. Because Kubo rarely builds conflicts around simplistic evil. His villains are almost always philosophically right, at least to some extent. Aizen simply hates the structure of the world itself. And honestly, the more you learn about the Soul King, the easier it becomes to understand Aizen's perspective and why he acts the way he does. He sees an entire cosmic balance resting on a being that has long since lost its own free will. With Yuak, things become even more fascinating. On the surface, he looks like a typical godlike tyrant, but his ideology is honestly much more disturbing than that. He truly wants to erase the concept of death and create a world without fear or loss. But his method is even more extreme. He wants to absorb every soul back into himself and return existence to the state it was in before separation. In other words, it's literally the merging of all life into one singular existence. And the scariest part is that I actually start to understand his logic. On some level, it even sounds reasonable. But at the same time, it's really a form of dystopian nihilism wrapped in altruistic rhetoric, almost like he's trying to deceive both the characters and the audience. Honestly, barely anyone talks about this. Most discussions about Bleach in 2026 still revolve around Bankai power scaling or favorite fights, even though Kubo was always writing a story about internal crisis. Even the structure of his arcs works like a psychological cycle. Ichigo faces a threat, loses, breaks emotionally, transforms, and only then overcomes the conflict. But the important part isn't the victory, it's the transformation of the character himself. And that exact formula later spread into a massive number of modern shonen series. But even with all my love for Bleach, I still think the series has some very real flaws, especially in the later arcs. At times, Kubo became so absorbed in aesthetics that the pacing suffered because of it. Some battles dragged on to the point where their emotional impact started fading, and several side characters simply disappeared from the narrative without receiving proper conclusions. And yet somehow, even those flaws make Bleach feel strangely human. Because the manga genuinely feels like a deeply personal work from an author who constantly created what he himself loved rather than what the market demanded. Maybe that's exactly why Kubo's style still feels impossible to confuse with anyone else's. Not through sales, not through awards, but through atmosphere, visual boldness, and the ability to turn inner emotions into both art and power. When you watch modern dark shonen, you can practically see Kubo's shadow in every other scene. And maybe the greatest paradox of Bleach is that a story about soul reapers ended up feeling unbelievably alive. That's exactly why the Hueco Mundo arc still feels so unique even now. It doesn't feel like a standard adventure arc. It feels like a slow descent into an alien civilization. Endless white deserts, black skies, and this constant feeling of emptiness. Kubo barely overloads the backgrounds with detail, but that minimalism is exactly what makes Hueco Mundo feel infinite and hollow. And honestly, Ichigo's fight against Byakuya still feels like one of the greatest moments in all of the big three to me, even in 2026. Not because the abilities were the most complicated, not because the stakes were the highest, but because Kubo perfectly built an emotional clash between two worldviews. Byakuya lives for duty and law, while Ichigo acts for the sake of personal bonds and emotional connection. Their conflict works almost like an argument over what matters more, the system or humanity itself. And honestly, moments like that are where Bleach surpassed many of its competitors. Naruto explored loneliness and cycles of hatred brilliantly. One Piece is built around freedom and dreams. But Bleach talked about fear, identity, and emotional emptiness. Maybe that's exactly why this story hits especially hard once you're older. For old 30-year-old guys like me, I think I finally understood the phenomenon of Tite Kubo as an author. He managed to turn shonen manga into something almost musical. You don't always remember every plot detail, but you remember the feeling. You remember hearing the soundtrack during Ichigo's entrance for the first time. You remember the tension that came with Aizen's appearance. You remember that cold feeling during the finale of the Quincy arc. And honestly, maybe that's what true immortality for a story really is. I'm genuinely happy that I finally experienced the full story of Bleach, and I seriously can't wait for the finale of Bleach TYBW, which is coming very soon. I also absolutely love the new Core 4 final part trailer that dropped not too long ago. What's most amazing is that even after all these years, Bleach continues influencing not just manga, but the way people view anime as visual art. A lot of modern projects became far more cinematic after the success of Kubo's approach, and you can clearly see that in the new TYBW anime adaptation. The studio is actively emphasizing the exact elements many people used to underestimate before, and the more I think about it, the more I realize one simple thing. Bleach was never a perfect story, but it was always a story with a soul. Maybe that's exactly why so many newer authors still reference Kubo even today. Maybe that's why the manga still feels so sincere. And I think I finally understood something important about it. This story was never trying to appeal to absolutely everyone. It simply stayed true to itself.